Hey everybody, I'm Eric Airlock, and this is another talk on Buddhist philosophy, specifically Buddhism in China. So please see my other videos about Buddhist philosophy, Chinese philosophy, and Indian philosophy, as well as Greek and modern European and else, about all of this. So the short story of the long history of Chinese philosophy is that the Zhou Dynasty collapsed into the Warring States period, about 475 to 221 BCE, other Sadducees, also known as the period of the 100 Schools, or the 100 Sages, 100 Philosophers, Philosophies, depending on the translation. As in India, as in many cultures, the word for philosophy, religion, school, teacher, can be ambiguous. Just as many great philosophers lost a parent as a child, they also tend to live in warring periods of instability, when old ideas are tested and questioned before new periods of empire and stability arrive and give new systems of movement support. So in China, the 100 schools, 100 because it's a nice round number, actually there are 4, and many other philosophies, they were dominated by 4 major native Chinese philosophies. Those are Confucianism, Daoism, Moism, and legalism. Now, this semester I'm not going to do legalism and Moism. I will do them next semester, as well as more videos on Daoism, and we're not going to cover actually Confucianism much at all this semester for Buddhist philosophy, even though you can do all kinds of things about Confucianism, Buddhism, and their intersection in China and elsewhere, all around. But the short story of the 100 schools, which we're not going to tell right now, but the short period of, like in Athens in Greece, the Glory Day, and Miletus and other places, Ephesus for Heraclitus, other places that had their Glory Day in the philosophy sun, possibly Apollo or the Oracle. You have here the golden age of Chinese ancient philosophy, and Confucianism is the first and foremost of these as the dust settled, then Daoism, also Moism, but first and foremost, in a sense, legalism. And that is because the Qin, confusingly it is spelled Q-I-N now, there are many things about the new system, pinyin, of Chinese translation, which is much nicer. But one of the such that Daoism is spelled with a D rather than a T, for my purposes. But unfortunately, Qi is now spelled, like energy, is now spelled Qi, and for some reason Q now stands for a CH sound, so the Qin, which is actually where we get the word China from, as much as you or I are mispronouncing that, the Qin, which is now spelled Q-I-N, but sounds much like the chin on my, and the whiskers right here. This, the Qin Dynasty, from 221 to 206, briefly unified China and supported legalism with harsh punishments and little regard for tradition. As they were into, legalism is known for being a bit utilitarian and a bit draconian, a bit harsh in punishment and a bit brutal, follow the rules, it's a new, simple, rule-based way. Some could see parallels, with many different modern movements and other things, although it is a strange, as all each thing is, a strange form in its own time. So the Han Dynasty, which took over, basically the Qin fought China into a unity, but then they didn't hold on to it for long, and they used legalism and harsh punishments to keep China unified, but then they became unpopular in the process. So the Han Dynasty, which is the formative dynasty of ancient China, right after the brief Qin, they hold on to what the Qin formed from 206 to 220, from BCE to CE, so about 400 years, 200 to 200 roughly, cross sides, a 0, 1, what have you, here in the middle, and then you have over on the sides about 200 years is the Han Dynasty. That in that period, the Han took over, and they decided people don't like legalism. So you have 3 other schools of major, the 100 schools, which is a lot of other folks that don't get mentioned much. One is the Yin Yang School, which the Taoists rip kind of the Yin Yang's famous symbol from. That they don't become one of the 4. Legalism is one of the 4, but it took over briefly with the Qin, and then you get rid of that, and nobody likes it much. And it gets complicated, but yes, Confucianism and legalism have interesting back and forths and crossovers, such that it gets confusing. But basically, the Han decided that they were going to support Confucianism as the central Chinese philosophy, religion, what have you. Words are quite fine and also inadequate. That they decided this was the philosophy religion they were going to support particularly, but they were also going to support, this is where it isn't exactly like supporting Christianity and on the side supporting Islam, which is not really what is done in Europe or elsewise. And the Jewish community is a different thing, and other communities, that you have here the Han decide we're going to first and foremost support Confucianism, but Daoism is also really popular, so we're also going to give Daoism support. They do not support Moism. Moism is actually a bit weirdly both traditional compared to the legalist, but also kind of communist, which some have accused the legalist of being kind of, in shape, brute utilitarian. Moism is very brute utilitarian. We will talk about that next semester with more Asian philosophy and Chinese philosophy. We're not going to get into much Moism with Buddhist philosophy because they strangely don't really, I'm sure they meet all over the place, but they sort of are not on the story, which is what this Chinese philosophy lecture is about, which is going from Indian Buddhism and early forms of Indian Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism, to then, as it comes into China, you have various forms of Buddhism. We will briefly touch on the Lotus School, but then becoming in the wake of Taoism, you have a form of Buddhism which we will spend several lectures on, in words that are so pretty, about Zen, which is Chan in China. So this is a lecture on Chinese Buddhism for the specific purpose of giving us the briefest of philosophical Chinese contexts to get us from my talks on Taoism to a talk on Chan in China, which is known in Japan and more popularly in America, especially after World War II, and contact with Japanese culture, is known more popularly as Zen. And I will often refer to it as Zen and then slide back and forth and call it Chan when I'm talking about China. It is effectively one and the same. And then, of course, things change as they grow and change, as all things do. As the Zen folks could tell you after slapping you in the face, possibly. You know, many of us need it. So, and yeah, yes. Anyway, jokes aside, let's get back. So, Chinese Buddhism is going to show us the context here where we have several different schools of Buddhism in China, and then one of those schools several divisions of, is known as Chan, and we know it as Zen. So that is where we will end up with this talk. So what we have here is the Han are supporting Confucianism, but also on the side they are supporting Taoism. Watch my talks on Taoism, and all of that is the ground such that Buddhism is coming into China as a foreigner, weird kind of system of thought, and human beings can be very xenophobic. I don't know if you know this, and so they're not really completely comfortable with other foreign things and systems coming in. And so when Buddhism comes into China, even though as an American Californian myself, I'm thinking China is very Buddhist. Of course, at the very beginning, it's interesting to think, of course, it was not, and it was strange foreign Indian things, and the Chinese didn't like it too much. In fact, Zen portrays the first patriarch, Bodhidharma, whom I love to quote. They portray him as a foreign, dark-skinned barbarian and kind of sort of almost Street Fighter Daoism, somewhat all quasi kind of racist, ethnocentric ways. So you even have embracingly that they kind of consider Buddhism this weird foreign Indian thing, and it's kind of strange and semi kind of barbaric hermit in the hills, even, sort of like some kind of guru weirdly. Which again is kind of amazing, and is not embraced by the culture and the countryside, of course. Especially with Taoists, who are already strange people in the hills, and they can merge a lot of the cultures that way. Strange people in the jungles of India, strange people in the hills of China. Hey, they have something in common or two. So in China, you have the four major schools: Confucianism, Taoism, Moism, and legalism. Legalism decides to side with the chin. It then goes down with the chin. You then have Moism is a bit too communist, so you have Confucianism and Taoism. And the Han coming up in the world, and that's wealthy, unified, early China. Again, prosperous golden age. There was much new money, much interest in philosophy, and patronizing the arts and temples. The old moneyed families, the new money families coming up, and the scholars are now competing and collaborating voices, which is what you can expect in a thriving culture in Egypt, Greece, China, etc. By the latter half of the Han, the Mayans, They're in the Han of China, not the Mayans. There were 30,000 students, supposedly, at the government-funded state university, which is, well, yeah, they had enough people, where primarily Confucianism and other classic texts were studied. On the side, Daoism. Daoism remained on the side, and then you have more during the Tang, and then Song, you have Daoism taking, and then Zen during the Song, taking more of a central role in the court, with with Confucianism being pushed to the sidelines, as well as other schools of Chinese Buddhism and Indian Buddhism that those Chinese schools are based on. Zen actually is known to us because it becomes the hip thing in Song China, which Song China is very much China's kind of pre-modern Renaissance-ish golden age. That comes later, after the Han, by about 1,200 or so years. So, unfortunately, for everybody who isn't Confucian and up in the Confucians, Confucianism is the orthodoxy at the Han time. And the Han, for the 400 years, this side and that side is zero, were holding on to power and making it very Confucian, and even keeping the Daoism at bay, and with the peasants in the countryside, which eventually becomes the Yellow Turban Rebellions and other things. So skeptical calls for revisions to the Confucianism within the Confucian community, because not all Confucians or anyone think alike. There's always squabbling within the community and debates. That you then have weakening of Han power towards the end of the 400 years, and many scholars are increasingly looking to Daoism and thinking Daoism is something really hip and artsy and interesting and beatnik and outside. Particularly, they were looking at the two main texts, the Tao Te Ching and the Chuang Tzu. I have several videos I've already covered many different points of the Tao Te Ching and Chuang Tzu, and then actually I blended in points from Tang China particularly. And I think a thing or two of Song made it in there, but most of the classic stuff from Daoism is in the Han, or the Warring States to Han, and then you have, well, technically the Warring States solidified in the Han, as talked about in the other videos, and then you have added to that commentaries up through, and then famous commentaries in the Tang, which is around 700, 800. So again, the Renaissance for Europeans is around, 1300s, 1400s. And so the Chinese are having golden ages in the 700s, 800s, and then also in the Song is 1100s or so, about 1,000, 1100s. Which then dovetails with Islam, having a lot of stuff, and then passage of lots of technology, printing technology, etc., gunpowder, come through to Europe during the Renaissance, etc. It does seem the language barriers, though, did present a decent barrier to philosophy, but not entirely, not any time, and the Italians did know some Chinese things. Not entirely, though, and it is interesting what they could and could not know. Or did and did not, whatever that means. So, the peasants, unfortunately, still, are increasingly, or were in ancient China, increasingly desperate. And so you have the scholars and the critical people in the court are turning away from Confucianism to Daoism. The peasants in the countryside are already very Daoist and into all of that, which interestingly makes, still that remains today, where Daoism is both a philosophy for philosophers and scholars and sages, and also it happens to be which was not exclusively or separately divination and mystical forms of understanding nature, and you have that divide even today, which is not simply the city versus the country at all, but still Taoist philosophy and Taoist practice are considered in China philosophy versus essentially horoscopes, and there's a very great divide of people in China who do and do not believe in those sorts of things, which I'm not an expert on. So the peasants are turning to Taoism. You have the artists, and you have the countercultural scholars and others turning to Taoism. And this is right as Buddhism is coming over the border from India in the end of the Han. That is around, that would be around 150, 160 is when the Buddhist pilgrims are coming in, and we have records of texts. There are scraps before that, but we do know that solidly Buddhism is coming into China about 150, 160 CE. So, essentially in Western stuff, you have Rome, which is going into its sort of mid and then later period. And they have, yes, that's Rome going into its mid-later period, outside with the birds. Inaugurations, etc. We were talking about divination systems. Got one squawking outside. Essentially, the largest I may have to shut the door if that keeps up. The religious communities of worship were increasingly the communities of worship in the countryside were increasingly centers of peasant rebellion. The largest were the Yellow Turban rebellions of 184 and then 189. Again, before Jesus, you're counting backwards, of course, and now we're counting forwards. So, yes, 184, 189 after zero mark. You have basically Yellow Turban Rebellion 1, Yellow Turban Rebellion 2. That's as Buddhism is increasingly flowing into China. The Han brought the princes together and put down the rebellions, kind of like actually the German period of pessimism in 1849 after the Germans kind of get together. The Germans never had a German revolution, and they were kind of sad about it afterwards, culturally and other things, turned to pessimism with Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and other stuff, philosophically and popularly with songs and skepticism, because you've heard of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the German Revolution, and I try, yes, no, 9, because they did not, the German nobles, kind of in the Austrian noble, the Austro-Hungarians and all of them's, they put down the German peasants, made sure they didn't have a German revolution, which the peasants were rather sad about, and Nietzsche can tell you all about how history may not, Schopenhauer says history doesn't change anything, dang it, which is a bit of pessimism and skepticism about all of that, sort of. Gets complicated with him. He called himself a Buddhist, actually. Was the first German I know of to call himself one. But haven't been there the whole time, or largely ever. The Han, basically, like the Germans, got together, and the princes put down the rebellions and the Yellow Turban rebellions, and the peasants, and prevented them from having a massive sort of possibly Taoist and or Moist revolution. But in the process, they actually then, after they had that not to fight, they fell apart kind of amongst themselves, and the Han decently fell. That power vacuum is what allowed Buddhism to come in. If the Han had held for another 100 years, perhaps they would have held on to more Confucianism and then added Daoism and kept Buddhism out of China decently. Perhaps. Doesn't seem like that was the plan. But it was definitely viewed hostilely at first, and it was right as the Han fell that Buddhism was coming in, and that allowed people to turn towards Buddhism as a new, strangely Taoist kinda thing. The Chinese definitely saw Buddhism as a strange form of Taoism, but the Taoists, they don't have monasteries at that time. They did later imitating Buddhists, actually. They did have shrines, etc., but they would be off in the hills and being sages unknown and also having texts. They would have forms and temples and things, but they did not have monasteries and the kind of, the long, complicated, very specific, oddly German. The Indians are oddly German because they just ram a bunch of words technically together. The Buddha kind of likes doing that. So oddly enough, that the Buddhists come in and they seem kind of scholastic to the Chinese, kind of like Confucians, and they have shaved heads and they're all disciplined, unlike Taoists, but then they also tell you relativism and perspectivism and many sides of the elephant, a la the Jain metaphor. They may pick up from the Jains or proto-Jains. So they sound like they're philosophically Taoist to the Chinese, but at the same time, these guys are all disciplined and shave their heads and seem like they're almost Confucian scholars, but of a weird, strange culture and dress and form. Imagine Buddhist monasteries coming in when you had nothing like Catholic or Buddhist monasteries. Again, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam are the largest forms of culture that humanity's ever seen. Imagine if Catholic monasteries, come into Latin America and you're, the Mayans. Imagine if Christian, Buddhist monasteries are coming in on Confucian China, also Taoist. Imagine what that would look like. Of course, it would look like Confucian scholarship, but a strange thing that wants to build its own buildings, Much like Mormons' children, Yes, the right answer is Mormons, again with South Park. So essentially, Taoism is offering an alternative to all the Confucianism, and then Buddhism is coming in and offering something Taoistic, but also disciplined. So there's a branching group of people, some of whom like a lot of Confucianism and like the discipline and the structural study of philosophy. And then there's other people who like it because it sounds strangely Taoistic. These forms will merge in Zen Buddhism in a very interesting way. Because while I like to think of the Zen Buddhists as very philosophical, they like slapping people and being very simple, and other schools of Chinese Buddhism are known for going on and on and on philosophically. So odd enough, at this time, the Buddhists were not slap you in the side of the face Taoists say almost nothing. They were into being quiet and meditating. But you can see that Zen is very much the Taoist kind of impulses and behaviors added to the Buddhist monasteries, and then you have very devoted, shaved head, sullen Buddhists cracking Taoist, sometimes very sexual jokes as celibates and slapping people, which is the behavior, oddly it seems, flourishes in Buddhist monasteries as Taoist behavior, which the Taoists didn't have the monasteries, as Zen. Well, we know it as Zen, they knew it as Chan, didn't even know it by that name as it was first starting out, as usual. We will get to all of that. We are nowhere near there just yet, but we will in the next talk or two. So some early Taoist tales, I love these, I did a video on this a long time ago, sound much like later Buddhist koan stories. Lu Ling, a Taoist master, a trickster sage, was often drunk and sometimes lay around his house completely naked. Again, a little bohemian and beatnik in the Bay area here. Yay, the Bay. We know a little about the beatniks and the hippies and the people who like to lay around naked occasionally. You know, you gotta wipe down the furniture. And when several men entered his house looking for him, several sages, and they see him laying around naked, he's like, hey man, you know, we were coming to talk philosophy, here you are naked. And he replied, as a poet and as a Taoist, heaven and earth are my dwelling, my home, and my house is my pants. What are you all doing in my pants? And this is, again, as an appropriate reply as anyone in such a state has possibly given. As uplifting as these sorts of stories were, the Taoists were offering something like this sort of kind of almost Diogenesian bohemianism, which was awesome and flourishing. Otherwise, we would not have the evidence of it here and there, would we? But it's not really kind of Buddhist monasticism as far as turning to a serious alternative from Confucian scholarship and study, is it? Although Confucius does say he thinks that meditation, he is not thinking of Buddhists, he would not have known. He thinks meditation, like for Taoists and then for Buddhists, is worthless and useless. You should just study. Well, the Buddhists know how to study. They also know how to fast and do all sorts of disciplined practices like Confucians, but they also meditate, unlike Confucians. Later Neo-Confucians actually do practice meditation exercises. Taoists, however, do have meditation exercises and disciplinary, some would say very harsh, like Jain's disciplinary exercises. But they believe in being disciplined to be Taoist fools and also to go around slapping people, which is much more Zen, even though they stay in monasteries. Everybody here would be somewhat comfortable with white rice gruel, except that you're not even supposed to eat the 5 grains for plenty of these Taoists. We'll get even more into that as we go along. But this is here kind of a Buddhist koan story. You have with heaven and earth are my pants. That itself sounds like a lot of koan stories, which are short little encounters between Zen masters. It's like, hey fool, what do you think? And then they flip you off, or they slap you in the face, or they do something interesting. And that isn't completely meaningless. It actually, in context, can mean a great deal, and then more so, I would say. But what do I know? I have here an image in my work of the Buddha reclining. The Buddha, whenever the Buddha is pictured kind of kicking it, in fact, I have Buddha right over here, of course, floating up here in the picture, that it's also a cat bridge, that whenever the Buddha is reclining, that is an image of the Buddha dying. That is sort of like a Stations of the Cross kind of thing, like in Catholicism, where the Buddha in various postures, much in, of course, and we actually are recently very literate as human beings, and it would only be the nobles who would know any math or literacy very much at all. So even society was not, let alone the universe, was not structured by math or literacy much until very, very recently, and all of our common behavior, which is quite similar, actually, the whole way through in all the culture, is general human behavior. That essentially you would have something like images which, of course, without words would convey a great deal of stage after stage after stage. And interrelated with other stages, the Buddha reclining is the Buddha in the final stage of death. I believe there's 4 stages officially. There's the 5 of these, the 4 of these, as Buddhism is codified. I don't spend much time in that. I do love Buddhist philosophical ideas. I spend a little bit less time in what numbers of codified doctrine things are, and a little more time in what philosophically I can glean and connect to, with many other things, and between schools. But you have here the Buddha reclining, like in Street Fighter in the background of the video game, reclining there in, I believe, Thailand, that is the Buddha dying. So I have an image of that, wanted to explain on the site, in the notes. Please follow along again with all these talks on my website, and yes. So when Buddhism came into China, scholars were debating whether it arrived first by land. Scholars have debated today whether Buddhism arrived first over the Silk Road or by sea in southern China, spreading upriver. Today it's thought, and as usual, it could be some of both, and then which was it most so, because there's some evidence of both. So today it's thought that Indian Buddhist evangelicals, missionaries, monks, and nuns first arrived by the Silk Road and then took both routes over the next several centuries. If you do not know this, I am a history of religion guy and history of philosophy, which the world actually needs, again, is whether or not you like any of religion or philosophy at all. That, given the history of it, many people are familiar with Christian evangelicals and Christian pilgrimages and Christian hostels for pilgrims, not realizing, unlike the movies, hostel, yeesh, that kind of thing is very Buddhist and Islamic too. That people would be taking pilgrimages like the Hajj, doing several stages, and then that would symbolize and also make you go through certain processes, certain stages of devotion. It would symbolize this and that philosophically. So there are Buddhist pilgrims and evangelicals who are not only going back and forth to China, but carrying Buddhism from and to China, and going from China as Chinese Buddhist monks to go to India, and then Indians coming to China, and of course had to get there first we're bringing the Buddhism over first to plant it there. And you would have all of these kind of practices are very human. And again, of course they would be. It's just one might never hear of it, but yeah, their pilgrimages and religious pilgrimages are set up to create trade routes and create stops and hostels and to make inroads into civilizations and become, to spread and to grow larger, of course. So there's a Chinese legend, I do love this story, that says Emperor Ming of the Han, who ruled, I don't have that here, from 28 to 75 CE, this side of the zero mark, saw a flying golden god in a dream and asked his advisors who it was, and Fu Yi told him that someone known as the Buddha has obtained the Tao in India, which is how the Chinese would understand it, who flies through the air and shines like the sun, which is oddly in the Patika Sutta of the long discourses of the Buddha. Buddha rises into the air 7 palms high after he says, I don't even need to do miracles. And this guy says, hey, do miracles. I don't even need to, but I'm going to show up. The other guy doesn't show up to the debate. Then the Buddha's like, and then at the very end of the text, it's like, by the way, I can also do miracles, which does seem for religious studies like it's possibly added on, where it's like, oh, the Buddha doesn't need to do miracles. By the way, our guy can. Hey, look, he said he can. And whether or not, again, you or I believe the Buddha could or did do miracles, that after saying, I don't need to, by the way, the guy didn't show up, see, I don't need to, okay, here, check this. And he basically flies into the air and shines like the sun. He rises in the air 7 palms high, which is flying, and shoots a fragrant beam of light upwards, which is quite shiny. Also very Dragon Ball Z awesomeness. Unfortunately, we can't find evidence of Buddhism in China. And I was like, yes, and maybe he shouted through the triangle at people, which is all Trinitarian, Buddhist, Indian, kind of stuff. We can't find evidence of Buddhism in China before the Buddhist prince and missionary An Shigao, from who knows to 180 CE, who first translated texts into Chinese in 148 CE, 50 years before the fall of the Han Dynasty, as its Confucian power was crumbling and Taoist peasant rebellions in the countryside threatened the empire. I did say it was in the 50s and the 150s and 160s CE that Buddhism comes into China, and you can see it with little pieces here and there, and thus some of the first translations are in 148, right, near 150. So Buddhism at first was regarded as a strange foreign form of Taoism, as said. The two religions fought and supported each other, alternatively, over the centuries afterwards, in spite of the profound similarities, and I love going through the different philosophies. I can find all kinds of crossover. And then you can do Zen, which is the crossover, quite physically and in the monasteries. And if you think Zen just makes no sense, again, it makes more sense and then also makes no sense, which is awesome, or undoes sense, or does more sense the other way, whichever ways you like it. It does that much better if you know Buddhism and Taoism, early Buddhism and early Taoism before you know the Zen, as keep saying, and we are getting to. That you have, in spite of the fact that the two are extraordinarily similar in many ways, that Indian and Chinese language, even in spite of the fact that both are skeptical forms of philosophy, you could say, and also say we should transcend the worldly, that they have very big differences that are rooted in Indian and Chinese language, such that Chinese language at that time, I was mentioning the Germans, and I do usually here as well, I already did that. The Chinese use short terms, did tend to use shorter terms, and sort of clear, brute metaphors, while the Indians, who use metaphors as well, string long terms together so that they can come up with hyper-specific philosophical terms, which you find sometimes, especially, again, in the Germans, others. You can see modern science and sort of pseudo-Greek Latin does very similar stuff. Need not. It's one of the things, as a philosophy type I do mention, is science could give things very easy to understand terms. If you don't find the terms easy to follow or understand, that's sort of a choice to leave things in pseudo-Latin Greek, which may or may not, octopus can be octopuses because it's a pseudo-Greek Latin mashup word. And people are sort of fooled into trying to be regular with it, as such that there's octopi, or not. That, similarly here, you have a long, that Indian thought crams a bunch of words together and kind of says this is a hyper-specific thing, whereas Daoism and then Zen would get much more into simple terms, like simple words, simple turns of phrase. It is known in Zen as a turning word, is to say something like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Which, if you think about going on and on and on with the Buddha and the long discourses, and then you think about Indian thought and Indian Buddhism stringing long, complicated, German-like philosophical terms together, when Zen Buddhism gets a bit Taoist and says, what is the sound of one hand clapping? They're trying to be philosophical. They're trying to be like Diogenes, but like Diogenes of Greece. They're trying to do philosophy in action and do it simply and say your long, complicated academia cannot match my simple slapping you in the face very occasionally. So, yes, it does remind of the Irvin Welsh story I always like to tell. There is a Irvin Welsh, the Scottish author, in his book of stories, The Acid House, has a story about two analytic philosophers in a Scottish pub. Soccer hooligans come in. A soccer hooligan is convinced the two have to fist fight. So they go behind the bar, and the main narrator decides for no reason at all other than his situation to deck his fellow professor in the face. And the story ends, he had never felt so alive up until that moment. Which, of course, is kind of like slapping people in the face being the best philosophy. But that's not meant to be non-philosophical. I would say, in fact, the whole story is not meant to be simply lacking in wisdom or insight or an understanding. It's just kind of meant to punch or slap you in the face a little bit. And please don't do that to your fellow professors, Again, this is not how we get tenure, In fact, nowadays, it's not how anyone does, but heck. So, Chinese was valuing brevity and simplicity of saying things. I do too, oddly. But Indian kind of academic philosophy and Buddhism was putting things in very complicated terms. And in fact, there are many, as mentioned, Chinese Buddhist philosophical schools that were highly philosophical, and Zen was a slap in the face to them, which is why it became the hip beatnik thing of Song China, developing in the Tang and then turning into the hip form of emperor philosophy in the court in the Song. And you can make of that what you will. So a comparison of Taoist and Buddhist texts shows this immediately. Compare the metaphor of the well frog and the Shuangzi. You have the turf there. One of my favorite metaphors of that text, and it has so many wonderful metaphors, that the turtle or tortoise, again, I am not the biologist, or marine or otherwise, comes to the frog in the well, and say possibly toad, again, do I know? And says, hey, this is a nice pad you got here, but have you ever seen the ocean? And the frog says, what's that? And he says, it's water, stretches on forever. Frog says, BS, man, I've lived in water, comes in a tube my whole life. It's that he doesn't get out of his element, although he'd be back in it if he, even more so if he did. That you have in that, consider that compared to the middle-length discourses of the Buddha on the categories of existence and how each is inherently empty, which the Buddha talks out at length, and Shuangzi may have, but he wasn't recorded as doing that. He may have been recorded as more so telling people something like the well frog story and be like, huh? Which is a bit of a slap in the face of all of our pride. In China, apparently today, I am told that being called a well frog is being called kind of an idiot. The Pythagoreans say don't hold a candle to the wall. Don't talk to the, people who just aren't going to learn. Buddha said you don't talk, there's a bunch of reasons to say something. You don't say it if it's not, if it's true, but it won't work. And there's other reasons not to say it, like you're going to get punched in the face at the wrong time by these guys, So duck and goose. Essentially, what the Buddhists, in examples here, to get back to it, like the example of goose, consider the Buddhists would refer to perfection. The Taoists would refer to something being round. These are, of course, transliterations of the terms, but we can transliterate them to single syllables or dual syllable words as opposed to 3 or 4 or 5. I do always like to mention a guy by the name of Paul Ziff, I believe American philosopher, wrote a book about semantics. And he says that you can't that if your hand was stuck to the wall and you said, I'm going to liberate my hand, it would be a joke because your hand doesn't go through any political processes. So something could be perfect, could get to perfection. That would actually involve like boilers or like certain kinds of cleansers. But if something is round, it's a nice ripe fruit. Of course, something is perfect if it's a nice ripe fruit, but perfection is more syllables. It almost implies it goes through more complicated processes of civilization and compartmentalization and understanding. Round is nice and simple. This is not something that Indian language would not have this in it already. This is that Buddhism in India had turned into a very long-winded academic discipline, oddly enough, as much as you and I may identify Buddhism with Zen. And the Zen also like to study, and they know their literature, and they know how to philosophically debate. And they also worship gods and spirits and have ceremonies and such. And yet, they are known for being very quiet philosophically, being nice and round, and smacking people around. So the Buddhists would refer to something as like one's true nature, which is, again, what is that? If I say the essence of something, okay, essence of this, what do you mean essence? What, are we going through a process? Essence of fruit is what? What did you do to it? While Taoists would refer to something like the pupil of the eye, which again, you don't have to do anything to that. That's very much right there for two people who can see. This was the same situation when Buddhism comes to Japan around 550 CE. So that would be 400 years after abouts it comes to China. Daoism and Confucianism had arrived long before. The Japanese also understood Buddhism in a Taoist natural world context. Chinese and Indian Buddhist cultures were also at odds socially. Chinese society was familial, which many are, and Indian society is. But you had the forest dwellers by that time of India, the strivers, going off and forming their own systems and being kind of countercultural. In India, you can go off and do that once you're in retirement age and you're in the elder stage of life. But these philosopher guys who had acquired monks now come in and they say, hey, we have celibate people who are following philosophy and shaving their heads. At first, and it is not just the Chinese, it's the Hawaiians and a bunch of other people who like having a lot of kids and long lives, although that's famous in Chinese culture as well in particular. So you come in as Buddhism and you say, by the way, give us your kids, they'll stay celibate and never have any kids. And you can imagine the average Chinese family, even Chinese American family, would say, I don't know if we like the pressure from the grandparents on that one. And that again, oddly, I'm sure that's also India, pressure to have the grandkids, but at the same time, that's a foreign system comes in and says, by the way, give us your kids, they won't have kids. I don't know if I like that there. That sounds iffy to me. And of course, thus, it was a little weird, especially if you're speaking a bunch of philosophy jargon and complicated foreigner talk. Again, I always like that. Yes. Well, anyway, jokes come to mind. I should not tell all of them. Again, I should use no art. So you have the essentially. Indian Buddhism is valuing the otherworldly, kind of like Taoism, which says, hey, go off into the woods. For the early Buddhists, go off into the jungle of India. And it advocates leaving the home in pursuit of enlightenment in the monastery. So while Taoism did have its wandering and wilderness-dwelling sages, this would be a sticking point for Buddhism for many centuries, and you would find Chinese texts saying proclamations and evangelical tracts of other of Confucians and Taoists and others, saying, look at these guys trying to have us have not kids. I mean, can you believe these guys? I did read something I mentioned the other day in one of my videos. I read something that interreligious prejudice is actually even worse possibly than racial prejudice, which means especially in teaching Eastern thought, and I have been thinking about this the last couple of days, exposing people to Confucianism, Daoism, etc., can be very scary. It's not going to kill you or hurt you. But of course, people have beliefs. You don't want to necessarily challenge them or make that legal or illegal to challenge them. I wouldn't. So exposing people to something like Islamic thought, or also then even for farther out from Europe, Indian and Chinese thought, which Europe does not share borders and wars directly with, and both do with Islam in the middle again, which makes it a harsh relationship on either side. These are things that people, are a little bit averse to hearing, and they were in China when Buddhism first came in, which is not the first thing any white American would think. So the Japanese also, in this sense, understood Buddhism as some kind of Daoism-ish. And yeah, that's me going back in the notes there for you. Getting lost on the point. So many competing Confucians and Taoists would call for routinely an expelling of the foreign Buddhist culture from India, and asked the young to abandon their families for the monastery. To overcome that, the Buddhists, like Taoists, offered local communities support in education, medicine, and relief in times of crisis. Gradually, Taoism and Buddhism were interrelated, with the Buddhist Dharma teaching equated with the way, the Tao. Dharma is a way of things in that it's a discipline. So a discipline could be a teaching and a practice. Think, of course, if I show you several yoga postures, that would be a teaching, but it would also be a practice and a praxis and all of that. So in a certain sense, Dharma is a way. So actually, that is a decent translation, although it could be hooked up slightly to this and that in the ways that a teaching is not exactly the Tao or way. But yes, a teaching is a way. And Buddhist nirvana, liberation, equated with the Taoist Wu Wei. Now that's a little rougher. Taoist Wu Wei is acting less, pretty much as effective. It's not actually the same thing as possibly then you gain a state of enlightenment once you get into that. That's actually sort of like, the Taoists do say, then there will be illuminated brilliance. So in a certain sense, the Taoists do say, if you practice Wu Wei, if you're minimalist, you will then be enlightened. That's pretty clear in the Taoist text. That doesn't actually say non-action is itself enlightenment, and that could be one of these rough translations. Honestly, you find in a lot of texts weird stuff. I remember learning in a class that at a certain time around the year, like 800, some people would have Latin texts in Europe, and that some would translate a word as God, and others would translate the same word as tree, and you would think that would be a little bit of a mistake, So here, of course, there's plenty of room for people to get stuff completely wrong or somewhat wrong, and this is the best of somewhat wrong, sort of, again here. So even though it's slightly off, again, I want to say there's plenty of other things that are quite amazing all over the world as far as, wow, they translated that as that. Well, that's a problem. So that is not that big of a problem, So we can act less Wu Wei on all of that and talk less right here about it. They're crude equations, but they were enriched over the centuries with translation and scholarship, and then just like in our own, we would have something get fossilized, and then we just understand it that way and say, oh, by the way, that French expression doesn't exactly mean that, or something like that in English. And several early Indian schools of Buddhism were popular than others in China, particularly the Dharmaguptakas, not associated with the Dharmagupta of the long discourses, a Mahayanan sect that made great efforts to spread eastward. The Chinese monk Kumarajiva, or Kumarajiva, alternatively, who lived from 344 to 413, translated many Sanskrit texts with great literary skill, including the Mahayana Diamond Sutra and Lotus Sutra. Those are particularly important. We'll get into that in either this or another talk. Clarifying, revolutionizing, and codifying Buddhist philosophy and practices in a Chinese particular way, such that the new native Chinese sects of Buddhism became the most popular, including, still today, the Pure Land Buddhist schools, founded by Hui Yuan, and focused on devotion to Amitabha Buddha, known in Japan as Amida. There's that giant Buddha in Japan you may have seen that's a sitting Buddha that's like this, very serious, and has the hands like this. That is Amida Buddha, which is a very great devotional bodhisattva Buddha being of Japan, and that is Amitabha of the earlier Indian Pali and or in later increasingly Sanskrit. So better known by the, but then contrasted to the Pure Land devotional schools, which we will say something about them briefly here, because we won't spend much time with the Pure Land schools. But the Pure Land schools focus on devotion to particular bodhisattva beings. But then you also have Chan, which is known as Zen, which we will be spending a long time on. We know as Zen, which became the court religion of the Song Dynasty, and it gradually clawed its way up past the Pure Land schools to become the hip philosophical school. Other schools were also philosophical. The Pure Land schools are particularly devotional. Much of what you see as East Asian Buddhism that you would see in American Buddhist temples is Mahayana Buddhism, and specifically Pure Land East Chinese and Japanese. There's temples in Oakland, etc. Berkeley has many, many churches and temples, actually per capita I think more than most areas. I don't know that exactly. But a lot of what you could see as Buddhist temples in America would either be Thai or Cambodian, which is something else. That is Theravada, original Buddhism. But you probably are seeing second wave Mahayana temples, and probably you are seeing Chinese and Japanese Pure Land Buddhism, which is that they would have statues to particular bodhisattvas, and there would be chanting and prayer and hopes for Pure Land and favorable rebirths. And that is often seen as, is not non-philosophical at all. People can get into long debates about the Buddha and his talks and his ethics and his philosophy and epistemology, but they would be primarily, and I did learn from Japanese Pure Land Buddhists decently enough myself, some of this stuff, is that they are not the same as the Zen. The Zen folks, the Chan in China and Zen, they split off and do their own thing. And it is wonderful to know that a lot of what you see as religious devotion in America as Buddhism, as well as East Asia, is Pure Land Buddhism. And then also, unless it is explicitly and specifically the other popular offshoot of East Asian Chinese Buddhism, here is Zen, which again we will be spending more time on. I'm not going to actually talk much about Zen other than put it in context in this video. We are then going to go patriarch by, central patriarch by central patriarch, starting with Bodhidharma, pretty soon after this video. Again, I got to see if we're going to get through the Lotus School. Probably not. No, we already got enough on this. So let's finish this out. So the Buddhist sutras continue to arrive from India, carried by both Indian and Chinese Buddhist monks on pilgrimages to spread the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha. In architecture, the Buddhist stupa became the Chinese pagoda. When I was young, we used to go to Stowe Lake all the time in Golden Gate Park. There's a Chinese pagoda there. It's actually only sort of a single level, kind of a gazebo, I think, of sorts. Maybe it's not. I think it's definitely a gazebo, possibly pagoda. That's not a band name yet. It's more of an album title again. Keep saying. That you have the Indian stupa, which is actually a burial mound symbolically of the Buddha and other great Buddhist saint bodhisattva figures. Well, later. And then you would have, early Buddhist stupas would never be to bodhisattvas, because that's a later Buddhist concept, that you would have Buddhist mounds to Buddha and early primary Buddhists, not yet bodhisattvas. Some became that. And then you would have the stories of that became one of the most recognizable forms of Chinese architecture. I grew up in San Francisco. You go to Chinatown, you see the layers of it. Those layers of things and the pagodas, those are actually the levels of mounds of burial of the Buddha thing upward. This is how, even though Buddhism was a foreigner, strange thing to Chinese folks at first, it became quite classic in Chinese culture to have all kinds of Buddhism interwoven with Chinese culture, including the pagoda. Forms are interconnected such a lot of times, in the same way our lives are interwoven in forms. Oh, I didn't know that came from there. A lot of times Chinese folks would not necessarily know that at all, because we're all quite ignorant of all the interconnections of these sorts of cultures. Not making, not judging. I don't know what that would be percentage-wise in the slightest, of course. But I have seen that in my students. Did not know that, before, even if they are Chinese American. The Mahayana completion of Wisdom Sutras. So the stupa, again, we said, is the pagoda. Chinese artists begin portraying the Buddha and Bodhisattvas in Chinese form. The Mahayana completion of Wisdom Sutras, the Prajnaparamita Sutras, sutras were introduced, Sanskrit now, becoming the central text of the most popular forms of Buddhism today, Chinese and Japanese, again, Pure Land Buddhism, which focuses on devotional chanting to bodhisattvas for good fortune and protection. While Pure Land traditions were popular among common people and traditional noble families, the Chan of China, the Zen of Japan, became popular among scholars and nobles who pursued philosophy, literature, and the arts. This is also like Daoism, notice, as we already just said a couple minutes ago. The Pure Land tradition feeds off the faith practices of the Tiantai, and the Chan Zen feeds off the wisdom tradition of the Huayan. And much are based on passing trucks, I'd imagine. Or barges, as it were, as were the Aztecs. So both these, the Tiantai and the Huayan, teach the oneness of all things. But the Tiantai would say there are demons in the heavens and Buddhas in the hell worlds, while the Huayan would say that all is one and one is all. A little bit more abstractly, philosophically. We're going to get into Zen a bit as we go along here. So the Chinese early on did notice the differences between different Theravada Mahayana systems. The Theravada taught very much that it's gradual progress through seated meditation and study, which is more a bit Confucian. Whereas the Mahayana did seem to teach more so about Buddha nature is already within and can be radically and suddenly broken through. Both of these, that it's gradual sitting, radical breakthrough slap in the face, and a bit Taoistic, crack of a wisdom, break of enlightenment. Both of these come together and are debated in the Zen tradition because Zen believes in both gradual and sudden enlightenment, but actually they divide school by school in which ones they prioritize or that they focus on, interestingly enough. So all of this is a rapid expansion of Buddhism, the oldest of the three, Christianity and Islam, largest cultures of the world, into East Asia, which you had better believe if it gets chased out of much of India by Islam, this is how it remained one of the largest cultures in the world today. And yet China is primarily Confucian, originally. Among common devotional worshippers who sought refuge in new divinities, practices, and communities. Among scholars who found new philosophical concepts and texts to study and reread. And among the wealthy, who gave immense amounts of wealth to new temples, monasteries, and monuments with new designs and appeal to secure their own fortune with the new deities and with the people, of course. That's also important, whether or not you tick off the gods. Buddhist priests served communities and noble families. So Buddhism is both like the Catholic Church and like religion and like science, like everything. It's both given to the poor, but it's also banking a little bit extra for the wealthy. Giving them nice slogans written in calligraphy to post on their wall and art and other things like that, and personal private Buddhist tutors and monks, in their home blessing things, or priests. So it's also serving the wealthy and powerful while it's also teaching the poor whenever they possibly would to read, etc. So if, and especially if they shave their head and become a monk or a nun. So it serves the poor and the wealthy both in various ways, which is like modern politics, science, and humankind, in fact, if we're wise and see that well. The Buddhist organizations also funded hospitals. Think about Catholic, Jewish, and other hospitals. In the Islamic world, of course, it's a lot of Islamic-funded hospitals and tithing and all of that. Low-cost hostels for travel and pilgrims, as we already mentioned, who evangelicals are often pilgrims. Bridges and trees planted, even beside popular road, for shade for travelers. In the early Tang Dynasty, the Chinese Buddhist monk Xuanzang, X is pronounced HS, and I pronounce it as best I can, Xuanzang, famously journeyed to the West, which is the source of the story Journey to the West, or the Western Chronicles. But this is a perfect stopping point, and we're going to leave that, and I'm going to cover Journey to the West here in the next video. And then we'll get on to the Zen, I hope. Actually, we'll have to do the Lotus School. I'm sure because that's of interest. So, have a wonderful day, or night, or whatever it is, and I will see you, if I ever see you, because I can't see you right now. So, peace, much happiness, and more videos about Buddhism and Zen to come.